So just first off, an introduction to me. I am a assistant professor and wildlife extension specialist in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences at the University of Illinois. And I am from North Carolina originally. I grew up in North Carolina. I lived in the city of Raleigh, and then I moved to Kentucky, lived in the city again, but started to kind of venture out into nature a lot more as a wildlife biologist there. Did my PhD in South Carolina at Clemson University, and I worked in the mountains of Western North Carolina, which is my favorite place in the world to be, but I don't mind Southern Illinois too much either. We have property there now. My husband is a wildlife biologist in Southern Illinois, and I'm based in Champaign, and I go back and forth between the two places. And we are really lucky to have joined the ranks of you all in terms of being woodland owners. So we purchased 84 acres of woods near Anna, Illinois, and we absolutely love it. And we spend a lot of time out in the woods, and I really hope that you do too. And what I want to talk to you about today is some of the critters you'll find, but more so how to manage for those animals so that you can basically provide better habitat and even maybe have a little bit more access to seeing the animals in your woods. So I have done a lot of traveling as a wildlife biologist. I've gone to, let's see if I can make this meeting control go away in case it's blocking the screen. I've gone to Costa Rica and Peru and Tanzania and seen a lot of really cool wildlife and a lot of diversity. And there's just striking colors out there. And it just seems as though the diversity might be elsewhere when you look at kind of National Geographic, you know, what the pictures of things around the world. You think all the cool stuff is somewhere else. But I have been really struck being a forest landowner now with how much diversity is in my own woods. And as a wildlife biologist, of course, I was aware that there's many species of frogs in Illinois, many species of snakes, hundreds of species of birds, for example. But being able to go out on your own property and see them and see the array of diversity is just really rewarding. And there's a lot of secretive animals out there that you might not otherwise notice. And so what I want to talk to you today about is how to provide safe habitat for those animals. And then also, you know, as I mentioned, how to see some of those animals. So this is kind of the goal of the talk, is to think about creating habitat or augmenting habitat that you already have. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about relates to reptiles and amphibians, which we collectively call the Herpetofauna. Herpetofauna means things that creep and crawl. And so snakes, turtles, salamanders, and frogs all get lumped into this group. And you're probably aware that these can be quite sensitive species, and that they already have a number of issues that they face. For example, snakes are now dealing with snake fungal disease. Amphibians, particularly frogs, are dealing with the chytrid fungus, and then there's also a salamander fungus. This is also true for bats. There's a fungus that's attacking bats. So they have their own disease situations that are causing population declines for some species. And then just because they're so secretive, these animals often are persecuted. I think that we fear what we do not understand. And because these animals hide beneath the leaf litter or beneath the bark or underground for so much of the year, so many people don't see them, and they just think of them as, you know, really scary animals. So I'm curious, maybe by a show of hands, and Chris, you can tell me what you see. How many people in this group have ever handled a snake with their bare hands?
We're getting a lot of yeses, and we're getting a lot of hands raised.
Cool. So you then know that snakes are not slimy, right? But I think the average person's perception is that a snake is a slimy animal, that they're kind of gross, right? And I think snakes are really cool. My husband likes to say snakes are people. They certainly have really interesting expressions on their faces, which are kind of permanently there. And they are obviously really neat in that they can just elude us so quickly. And they are just really have a poor view amongst the public. And I think it's because, and also just some misconceptions. And snakes are going to chase you. All snakes want to bite you, when in reality, most snakes don't want to have anything to do with you. And if you do handle them, they're more likely to poop on you than they are to bite you. So, I think people just have these perceptions of animals that are based in a lot of fears that are perpetuated in society, but also just not understanding them. So let's jump right in and talk about some of the key habitat features that you can provide. And I will say that a lot of the pictures that I'm going to show you are from our own property here in Illinois. And this is my absolute favorite part of our property, which we had no idea was there when we purchased it, which is a small ephemeral pond. It is about maybe 20 feet across, and it fills with rain during late fall. And by the end of the summer, it is dry. And as a result, this pond has no fish. That doesn't mean it doesn't have predators, but it has no fish. And this is a great way to provide habitat for amphibians and reptiles and other critters on your property. This pond also provides us with no end of entertainment. We check on it almost on a daily basis to see what's going on there. So some key features that would make a good pond for amphibians is that it should be shallow, less than 3 feet deep. And it doesn't need to be very big. And of course, if you want more surface area, then just make another pond, right? We haven't made our own pond yet. We inherited this one, but we are talking about trying to create another pond, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. It should have gradual sloping along the edges. And something that you can do that's really important to make the pond good habitat for amphibians is to put tree branches in the pond. So I routinely try to find big branches that are heavy and that will sink to the bottom on one end and lay those into the pond. And then you can also put cover boards or rocks around the water body up on land. And what these features are going to allow is for amphibians to get in there, lay their eggs, not have to worry about fish as predators, and then to easily walk right back out of the pond when the time comes. So the different species are going to use the pond at different times of the year. And that's one of the things that's so exciting about a small pond, is that it's constantly changing and you can watch it throughout the year. So this is an example of what we deem as like really exciting at our house. I was traveling in Florida in early March, and my husband texted me and said, I just went to the pond and I saw, I'm pretty sure, 38 spotted salamanders laying their eggs in our pond. And these are the egg masses that we have in the pond, or had in early March. And this is a spotted salamander, which is a species that belongs to the group of mole salamanders. Somebody mentioned in the chat that they had tiger salamanders on their property. And this is a very close relative of the tiger salamander. And you may have seen spotted salamanders on your property with either all yellow spots or orangish spots, or even sometimes the spots can be reddish. And they're pretty big critters. They can be up to maybe 8 to 10 inches long, usually, kind of hefty. And if you do find salamanders, I would encourage you to be careful when you pick them up if you do, because the oils and any toxins you might have on your skin, amphibians have very sensitive skin. These guys do not breathe through their skin the way that some salamanders do, the plethodon salamanders, but they are pretty sensitive. And I have seen salamanders die from exposure to chemicals. But you could pick them up with leaves under your hands, or you can just get your hands dirty and pick them up if you need to move them, or if you just want to really inspect them to see how cool they are, because they are pretty neat. But these were laying their eggs in our pond in March. And not nearly all of these eggs are going to make it, right? So they lay really large egg masses. And if you look at the egg masses in the picture, you can see that it kind of all looks like one big blob. When you see frog eggs, each egg will be kind of more distinct as its own blob, and then the blobs are kind of pieced together more like a clump of grapes. So these salamanders come in the spring, lay their eggs, and then they depart and they'll go off into the woods, and you may find them near the pond, or they can actually move pretty far away from the pond. Not all salamanders lay their eggs in the spring, though. This is a picture of our pond in the fall, and the water is just starting to fill in now in late fall. And this is when the marbled salamanders will show up. And marbled salamanders are black and white. I don't have a picture of one, but they are also mole salamanders in that same family. And they come in the fall and they'll lay their eggs in the center of the pond, and they'll stay with them until the pond starts to fill in with water. And then they will retreat and leave their eggs, you know, to basically fend for themselves. And we had a pretty remarkable experience this winter. I'm sure all of you experienced the snow and the bitter cold in February. Hopefully your furnace was working, ours was not, but we made it through it anyways. And at the end of the snow, when the snow had just melted and the ice had just melted off of our pond, we went out and looked in the pond, and there were tadpoles in there that were about 1.5 inches long to 2 inches long, pretty big tadpoles. And clearly these were not from eggs just recently laid. These are the marbled salamanders that were laid in the fall, and then they overwinter as small tadpoles and start to develop, and then they subsist under the ice. And then when the ice melts, they're ready to go, and they're going to emerge from the pond early. So they have a little bit of a different life cycle phenology than the spotted salamanders, which is good because the spotted salamanders would eat them if they showed up in the pond and found them. So pretty cool to think about these different species using the pond in different ways. And of course, there are frogs that use our pond as well. I mentioned providing cover boards, and you can use just logs, but you can also go out and get wood to make your own cover boards if you'd like. And if you do that, of course, use untreated wood. Treated wood is bad for anything that is sensitive on its skin. It's even been shown to be bad for bats. If you make a roost for a bat out of treated wood, that can cause death. That was shown by a study in Europe in the 1970s. So I definitely encourage you to use untreated wood if you put it out. And we have put out pieces of wood like this around our pond. We actually have yet to find a salamander underneath them, but lots of things are using the space underneath these pieces of wood, as evidenced by all the burrowing. Now, you can also upgrade your bigger ponds, right? So many properties have these really large ponds right out front. And sometimes folks have a tendency to mow right down to the edges of the pond. And the pond has fish, so you might think, well, this is no good for amphibians and reptiles, but it actually can be really good. And you'll find that lots of species will use it. There's some things that you can do to make the pond a little bit more suitable. So one is to regrade the banks to provide shallow water on the edges. And a species that will benefit from this in particular is the American toad. Does anybody know the trill call of the American toad, which is happening right about now? I'm not a good imitator of the American toad, but they kind of go, and they have really cool egg masses that they lay these long strands of eggs. They're strings. They look like strings of pearls, and you'll find them in the shallow waters of ponds like this, a big fish pond. So they just hang out where the fish can't go. That doesn't mean they're totally safe. I did have a really interesting experience one time where I found a bunch of toads that had been attacked by raccoons on the edge of a really big pond. But that's still a great place for them to lay their eggs. And of course, you can allow wetland vegetation to colonize the shallows, which is going to provide places for amphibians to sit, like frogs can sit up on top of those. You can make a no-mow area along the edge of your pond. And you can also provide basking platforms for animals like turtles and for wood ducks. So I convinced my husband sometime last year that we needed to drag this white oak log from the woods to the pond and then somehow get it into the pond. This was not easy, but it has been tremendously rewarding. Just this little piece of wood that's about 4 feet long provides a platform for turtles and also for the wood ducks that visit our pond every year in the spring. So definitely encourage putting out some basking platforms. We have a dock in our pond that was there, you know, it's been there for many years, I'm sure, and it has the cross beams. And we saw the other day a turtle sitting on the cross beams for lack of a better platform. So it probably didn't want to swim all the way over to this log. So clearly we need to be putting out more logs for these guys to sit on so they don't have to sit on something so awkward as a cross beam. Now, another thing, I'm sure many of you have streams running through your property. We have one large stream, and then we have a number of small streams spilling into that larger stream. And we can't control what's happening upstream unless we start influencing the behavior of our neighbors. But collectively, I think we can all make a big difference in our water quality, which of course is going to affect the animals on our property, but it's going to have downstream impacts as well, not only on your neighbor's property, but also as it spills into the Mississippi or the Ohio, and ultimately what makes its way to the Gulf of Mexico. So reducing siltation and chemical inputs is really important. And if you have a driveway that crosses a stream or goes near a stream, if you can divert your road runoff away from the stream, that would be really important. It's difficult to well, it's impossible to totally remove the impact of humans on streams, but there's even evidence that near bridges where roads cross streams that you have in the stream, you'll have chemical influence from the outputs that come out of the vehicles that are driving over, just not even touching the water, but just the sheer presence. So anything you can do to divert that runoff away from the water is good. And then if you can avoid driving through streams, that's also ideal. Sometimes the stream bed is pretty rocky like ours here, and you're going to have less of an influence in terms of siltation. But in other cases, it could be really damaging to drive through streams. And you want to protect your upper reaches of your streams too. So there's a lot of talk in forestry about riparian buffers, and the size of the buffer is going to vary with the size of the stream in terms of what's the best practice for leaving around the stream. But if you can leave the vegetation around the stream in terms of larger trees or small understory trees, and try to remove the non-native species like bush honeysuckle that can cause actually erosion in of themselves because they're very shallowly rooted. And so you still have a lot of runoff of soil into the stream, which then goes downstream. Leaving rocks in your stream channels is also good because that provides habitat for a lot of really cool critters. I'll show you some pictures of those in just a second. And then of course, removing trash. And you know, we can't control, again, what our neighbors are doing upstream, but every time I walk the creek or the trails around our property, I'm constantly picking up things that have been washed downstream, whether that's an old oil container or a beer can from 20 years ago or whatever, but picking those things up to remove them and get those chemicals out of the environment and into a landfill, preferably, versus our streams. These streams, again, are an endless source of amusement. We are really lucky to have this nice serpentine channel of a limestone creek through our property, and we're hoping to remove a lot of the invasives. We have winter creeper, autumn olive, bush honeysuckle, and the honeysuckle vine all creeping around in our woods there. And we're trying to get that stuff out to provide better habitat for some of the critters that live there year round, including our cave salamander, which is up on the rocks on the stream in spring last year. And this is a smaller salamander that's going to be more closely associated with streams. Some of you may have the two-line salamander in your woods, or the long-tail salamander, which looks a lot like the cave salamander. It's just a little bit brighter and has these chevrons on its tail. But these species are very sensitive to chemical inputs, and so it's really important to have clean water sources for them. We also had a bronze frog hanging out in our creek bed last year, perched between some rocks. So really exciting to see these species, you know, using this habitat. And if you can make modifications to provide habitat for them, then you're going to end up with, you know, just more riches in terms of the species that are occupying your woods. They're going to come naturally, though. You can't really kind of make it happen. But if you and your neighbors are all practicing good habits, then hopefully you will see some of these. I will say that it's not easy to see some of these critters. And as you can see, we clearly have a flashlight on this frog. We're out at night and we're complete nerds in our household, but this is what we do for fun on a Saturday night, is go out and look for frogs and salamanders. So another thing that you can do to provide habitat is to accumulate dead woody debris. And this could not be more critical for so many animals, for snakes, for salamanders, for the insects. I saw somebody likes millipedes. Well, if you like millipedes, then dead wood is a great place, right? Fallen trees and branches on the ground, creating piles of branches beneath canopy gaps is a great way to provide habitat for snakes. Also for birds, and I'll show you a pile later that we've had a lot of success with getting some sparrows to use on our property. If you have rocky outcrops or bluffs, which is so common around Illinois, that's a good place to either fell or girdle some trees to create not only down woody debris for animals to use, but also to just put some sun on those bluffs, because those can be important. You may have snakes or other animals hibernating in the bluffs. And so just putting a little bit more solar exposure on this can be really valuable. Of course, you get all sorts of other organisms colonizing your dead wood. And this piece is a little bit long, but I spent last Saturday afternoon in the rain walking around flipping pieces of wood like this one to look for salamanders with my husband. And we found, I think, 12 of these slimy salamanders. This is a plethodon species, so it is one of those that breathes through its skin. They seem to have a rough life on our property because every one of them that we found had some evidence of damage on its tail, which means somebody tried to eat it. But they are good at regenerating their tails. They don't look quite the same, but pretty cool little critters. We also found one spotted salamander, and this was by flipping logs. So the picture on the right is the underside of a log, and the slimy salamander is, tucked up in there. So I definitely encourage you to go around and look for these critters, and also to put the logs back if you do flip logs on your property, just the way you found them, because that's the best way to attract more critters. It is important for them that the vegetation underneath a surface like that is decayed entirely. And another thing that you can do to create habitat for critters like this is to put out tin. So if you look on the right side here, you'll see a piece of tin that we've lifted up. So I learned this. I was a biologist in Kentucky for 3.5 years working for a power company. And we took sheets of tin that we would get from people whose barns were blown down. And we'd take the tin from their barn and we'd go lay it out in our power lines all over the state. And then when we traveled around the state to do our other work, we would always stop and flip tin. And there's this like kid in a candy store every time. It's so exciting. You never know what you're going to find. Although I did know that the species I was most likely to find in Kentucky were racers, black racers, and copperheads. Those were the two top species that we found under tin. So when we bought our property, I found some tin laying around the garage and I put it out, and imagine our surprise when the very first species that we find is not a copperhead or a racer, but actually a prairie king snake, which is just super exciting. So this king snake showed up last March at our property, and of course it eats voles and mice. It also eats other snakes. So if you're not a fan of all snakes, maybe you have some that you don't like, this snake will eat those snakes. So we are very excited to see it under tin. And we've actually had this species plus another species of king snake, the speckled king, under the same piece of tin, which is pretty remarkable. So it does take a while for tin to season because you need the material underneath, like I said, to decay before snakes will occupy it. You can also leave standing dead trees, and I definitely encourage this as a bat biologist. This is going to be great habitat, right? So this is actually a picture of a roost tree that we tracked bats to in South Central Indiana. And if you have trees like this on your property, you might listen and see if you hear bats using the tree. You can hear them squeaking sometimes underneath the bark. They tend to like trees that have pretty good solar exposure if you're going to have a colony of bats. Sometimes a single bat will use a tree that's pretty shaded. but usually those trees need to get some sun during the day for them to be usable by a larger group of bats. But trees with holes and hollows or with exfoliating bark can be really valuable for so many wildlife. So just recently we found a white-breasted nuthatch nest in a tree with nice woodpecker holes in it. White-breasted nuthatches aren't going to excavate a huge hole in a tree themselves, but they might benefit from a bigger bird like the red-bellied woodpecker, which can create quite a cavity, or a pileated woodpecker, but they will occupy those. And there's so many birds that use cavities. So definitely dead trees with cavities is really valuable. And just a couple more pictures. The one on the left shows you a tree that could be really good bat habitat, right in the sun, exfoliating bark. There's a number of species that would occupy that tree. And while I know there's not trees in there right now, there's not bats in that tree as far as I know. Just looking at that tree, I could see there being 30 to 50 bats using that particular tree from my experience with tracking bats to trees. The tree on the right is probably way too decayed for bats, but it is going to provide habitat for some of those cavity nesters like the birds I was talking about. And then of course it's going to fall over and provide habitat for salamanders and snakes as well. Here's an example of a Indiana bat roosting under the bark, exfoliating bark of a tree, just so you get an idea of how cryptic they can be. If it didn't have a band on it, you might not actually ever see that bat under that tree. And I have a little video here, let's see if this will play, of some bats emerging from a dead tree. This is in Northeast Missouri, but find your tree on your property and have a look at sundown, and you might be surprised at what you find. This is a dead shagbark hickory, I believe. So I'm curious, has anybody found bats using a tree on their property?
We don't have anything in the chat yet that says, yes, people have found bats.
All right, so I've selected the ultimate cryptic animal. So if you are interested in bats, which a few of you said you were in the chat at the beginning, then you might consider purchasing a small bat detector that you are able to use to listen for bats. And there are some relatively inexpensive models out there for $100 to $200. You can get one for less than $100. If you're interested, I'll put my email in the chat and you can reach out to me because I can give you a link for one. It's actually sold out of Europe, but you can get it shipped here. And you won't be able to identify the species with the lowest cost device, but you will be able to hear them. So as I'm sure you're aware, bats are echolocating using calls that are above the range of human hearing. And so it can be really difficult to pick up on them, but you could go out into the woods and listen around some of the dead trees you have to see what you see. Let's see if this will let me go to the next slide. All right, I'm gonna have to go over here and click. Okay, so I know that if you have bats or you're interested in bats that you might be thinking, should I put up some bat boxes? And as Chris has observed, I can give you a whole nother talk on that. And suffice it to say, I spend way too many hours of every day thinking about bat boxes. My graduate student Reed and I are doing a number of studies with bat boxes, and he asks me and talks to me about it all the time. So we think about bat boxes quite a lot. And in general, what I would say is that bat boxes are not needed where there's ample natural habitat. They can be dangerous for bats, actually. And I don't think that we want to start encouraging bats to use these artificial roosts when good natural roosts, like the one shown on the right side of the screen, are out there. That's a shagbark hickory. This is actually one that has a lot of damage to it. I don't think it's 100% dead. I think it's just maybe half dead. But this one, my students tracked an Indiana bat to in central Indiana, And Indiana bats are well known for their affinity for shagbark hickories, and they roost under the exfoliating bark on the live trees. And then if the tree dies, it becomes an even better roost. But there's so many species out there that can provide good roosting habitat for bats, even ranging from something like a red maple. If you're trying to manage timber on your property and you want to get rid of some of the undesirables that are maybe blocking your oak trees, and you want to create good deer habitat, for example, you can girdle some of your red maple trees. And even a small red maple will provide roosting habitat. Once it dies, the bark starts to slough away. And I have tracked bats to red maple trees. Some of the other trees, it might surprise you, would be like white pines will be good roosting habitat for bats. And of course, then other species are going to benefit too from those dead trees. So you don't need to put up bat boxes if you do have wooded habitat. And I would say focus more on thinning out your woods, creating big trees, creating some dead trees versus putting up these artificial structures. If you do have dead trees and you want to get creative, however, an arborist turned me on to this method. This is some photos from an arborist in Indiana. This is his test run, but he had some clients who were interested in creating habitat for bats and other critters on their property. And they had dead trees that he had topped and left the bottom part of the tree standing. And so he figured out a method using a chainsaw to take off a faceplate, cut some grooves into the tree, and then reattach the faceplate, and of course leave an entrance and access from below. And bats, and this has been demonstrated in Australia too, other critters like little marsupials will get into the tree and use these crevices, and even birds sometimes will use them. So if you are artistic with chainsaws and you want to play around, this is a good thing to try. And the reason that this is different than a bat box is that it's less likely to stand for quite as long. And it also is much less likely to overheat, which is one of the major problems that we have with bat boxes, because there's a greater thermal mass in a big dead tree than there is in a bat box. So I would not discourage you from trying this if you just want to be creative on your property. Now, I know you already had a whole seminar on this, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but controlling non-native invasives is a great way to increase and enhance habitat for critters on your property. So if you look in the background of this photo, you will see our complete nemesis on our property, which is these massive bushes of autumn olive that are everywhere along the edges of every field that we have. And then they've gotten into the woods too. And these bushes are just incredible. I'm sure you've experienced this yourselves. They grow out 30 to 50 feet from the root. So the trees just shoot out. And as my husband pointed out, he had studied deer a lot in our past life when we lived in South Carolina. And deer are really a critter of the edges. And they like to walk along the edges of the fields. And these autumn olive are just blocking out those edges. So we are spending a lot of time trying to remove autumn olive, which we'll probably never get done with, but we're working on it. And of course, you can kill the autumn olive. Well, not of course, because it is a crazy bush. It's a crazy plant. It just keeps coming back and back, but you can treat it with herbicides. But you need to be careful if you're trying to treat autumn olive or multiflora rose or bush honeysuckle, that you don't broadcast herbicides near water. And it's hard to get away from water. So what do you do instead? Well, you can use controlled stump treatment and treat the stump. And there is a nice brochure on how to treat non-native invasives that the Illinois Extension has put out. And I have a link for that here in just a second. And one of the benefits of removing the plants yourself is that you can actually create habitat from the plants. So we now have a mongo pile of autumn olive branches. It's much bigger than what's shown here. This is sometime last year. And this created winter habitat for rabbits and for many, many birds, including lots of sparrows. And we've put a piece of tin out there because we figure there's some snakes that were overwintering in the pile. So now we'll have a place to check for snakes around this pile. Eventually, we'll probably burn it, but these piles of debris can be great habitat. It can be daunting to try to control invasive species on your property. This is a patch of woods that has at least 3 major issues in terms of bushes, and then it also has stilt grass growing in the understory. So we burned it, but that's probably going to make the stilt grass come back stronger. We may have to burn it several more times. And then we're also planning to go in and try to remove as much as we can in terms of those bushes. But we picked out this small patch, it's maybe 1.5 acres, and decided we would just work with that instead of, you know, trying to remove all of those plants everywhere on our property. We're going to work on this one patch of woods, and that might be a good strategic approach to see how wildlife responds to your management actions on your property. So this is the booklet I mentioned that Extension put together. It's called Management of Invasive Plants and Pests of Illinois, and you can get it at this web address. If you just Google that title, Management of Invasive Plants and Pests, you should be able to find it. That's how I found it. I have a copy sitting on the kitchen counter, but then found it online. And it has a list of the invasives and then when you should treat them and what methods and what treatments are most effective. So that's a great resource. I mentioned using prescribed fire. Best practice for particularly amphibians and reptiles is to use this during the colder months. This is also true for bats because, of course, you don't want to burn up a dead tree that bats are in. So you can burn when snakes are below the frost line and then when salamanders are in moist locations so that they are protected from fire. And you may, if you're anything like us, you have tunnels all over your property, which are really annoying, but they're actually really important habitat. We have tunnels that must have been created by moles and voles and shrews and chipmunks. They're big, gnarly things sticking up. And then we have these crayfish burrows. This is a really good example of a crayfish burrow. And I promise you, I picked up the can in the background after I took the picture. Crayfish take these balls of soil and they mound them up and make a chimney. And you may be aware there's different kinds of crayfish that have different burrowing styles. So there's primary, secondary, and tertiary burrowers. And the primary burrowers are the ones that usually make these big chimneys. And they don't always associate with a stream. They may burrow all the way down to your groundwater and create a series of tunnels there and use the water. And then on rainy nights, you will see crayfish come up and start walking around because they get kind of inundated with water in their burrows. And there's some really cool crayfish diversity. Crayfish are strikingly diverse in the Midwest. In fact, this part of the country is the greatest diversity of crayfish in the world. So same thing that's true with salamanders is true with crayfish, that from about Western North Carolina over to Missouri is where you're going to see the bulk of the diversity in the world, which is really cool. So count yourself lucky to live here. And those crayfish and salamanders are not mutually exclusive, right? Those holes and burrows that the crayfish create, the salamanders can use those. Of course, they can also do a little tunneling themselves. And of course, the inhabitants of those burrows are important prey items for snakes and for other animals. So all in all, creating or leaving some of those tunnels on your property is going to provide habitat for lots of critters. You may have places on your property that fill in with water, and if you let that water pool naturally, you're going to find that more species will occupy your landscape. So for example, the cricket frog pictured here uses those low pools as breeding habitat. It can also breed in the margins of streams, but this is going to be food for snakes because many snakes depend on frogs as food. So definitely encourage you to leave those spots. Avoiding plastic fencing is a good way to protect your snakes. You may have places where you want to put up fencing to keep, say, deer out, but if you are conscientious about the kind of fencing that you put up, you're going to prevent snakes from becoming entangled in the fencing and dying from exposure. Sadly, this picture, which is the only one I stole off of the internet for this presentation, is a picture of fencing put up specifically for the purpose of excluding snakes and killing them. There is actually snake fencing out there that people put up in order to keep snakes from getting into their backyards. Seems like the fear is really driving that behavior. Most of the time, you're never going to see a snake. And if you keep your yard clean and mowed, you're very unlikely to provide habitat for snakes. As I've just mentioned, all the places that they like to be are places that are really tucked away. So speaking of snakes, if you do like snakes, you might want to cultivate some hibernation sites for snakes. And I'll show you a picture of what this could look like, but essentially what this would involve is digging a hole on a south or west facing slope. So for those of you that are interested in rattlesnakes, this could be a good way to provide a safe haven for them during the winter. Basically line the hole with gravel to prevent it from flooding. You want to put this in an area where it's not likely to flood, and then fill it with irregular rocks and concrete to create kind of a hodgepodge of open and closed spaces, and then backfill it with small rocks and maybe a little soil. And you can actually add rocks or vegetation to the exterior to allow snakes to sun. So this is a black racer under 10 at our place. And here's some other snakes we've seen in Southern Illinois, the garter snake top left, the western ribbon snake top right, and the green snake bottom left. These are all snakes that mostly eat things like caterpillars and worms and slugs. Garter snakes occasionally eat toads and fish. And then bottom right is the speckled king snake, which is a predator of snakes and lizards, and then will also eat mice and so whatever it can come across, basically. Doesn't eat humans, though. Here's the snake hibernaculum photo that I mentioned. So, digging a hole, lining it with some gravel, putting these large slabs in there. If you have a bunch of concrete cinder blocks laying around, this could be a good use for them to provide snake habitat. And then filling it in with smaller gravel. But you want to make sure that there's access points. And some of the guidance out there recommends you put some PVC tubes to allow snakes to move around in that space. I realize this is an activity for like the most intrepid of you, but I am sure that there are some folks out there that would like to put a snake hibernaculum on their property. So it's going to take time, but as you start to manage your woods, you are going to see animals naturally colonizing your woods. And I definitely encourage you to keep an eye out for them. And that's going to involve going out with a flashlight or going out and lifting up logs. Another thing that you can do, and I haven't mentioned birds too much, but I heartily encourage you to learn your birds. You probably know your yard birds, but looking at your warblers and at your migrant birds is really going to enrich your enjoyment of your property. And some of you may own the Sibley Guide to Birds, the book. There's also an app for the Sibley Guide, which is $20 on the Google Play Store or on the iPhone store. And this app is really going to be a game changer for you if you're out in the woods with binoculars watching for birds, because you will be able to figure out what you're looking at. And you can also play their calls and learn their calls so that you will know, when does the wood thrush call in your woods, and what does a black and white warbler sound like? I mean, for me, this has just been really amazing. Last April, now this April has been really weird because of the weather, but last April, we had 97 different species of birds we counted on our property. And again, that's no end of amusement, right? Just walking around looking at the birds. So here's some of our favorite migrants that move through. The pine warbler on the top left was attracted to the 3 pine trees in our front yard, which is basically the only pines on our property. And then we had the golden wing warbler move through in April last year, which is in the center. And then the yellow-throated warbler, aptly named, is the bird on the right side. So with that, I would like to say thank you for your time and attention.